Okay, so Brezhnev is going to die in 1985, and then again, like under Khrushchev, you're going to see a reduction in Cold War tensions when the new leader comes to power. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev. So he assumes control of the Soviet Union in 1985, and he is looking for reforms. Now, there were a few very short-term leaders after Brezhnev's death, and they were all quite old. They were all sort of similar communist hardliners, and what we see about Gorbachev that distinguishes him from the previous communist hardliners that preceded him was that he was a lot younger. He was in his 50s. So in a lot of ways, he's looking to introduce some potential changes to the Soviet Union, particularly because they are continuing to struggle economically. So one of the programs that he introduces is called Perestroika, which means restructuring. And so what Perestroika was trying to do was revive the economy, because the Soviet economy was still very much sagging behind the West. And so in a lot of ways, Perestroika kind of resembles a new economic plan under Lenin. Hopefully you remember that. And what Perestroika is doing is it's introducing some free market practices into the West, because before Perestroika, the state, again, completely controlled all methods of production. Now, Perestroika, it's introduced in 1985. Now, unfortunately, by 1987, Perestroika proves to be a failure. But still, just the fact that Gorbachev tries to introduce an alternative plan shows that he is willing to deviate from communism. So this is a really important change. Now, his more successful plan was called Glasnost, which means opening. And so the idea behind Glasnost was to open Soviet society by gradually introducing liberties that the Soviets hadn't experienced since maybe a little bit of the relaxation of tensions during the war. But in all honesty, they hadn't experienced since 1917 or so. And so what Glasnost does is it reintroduces free speech, some political liberties. It ends censorship for parties outside of the Communist Party. And what Glasnost proves to be is much more successful than Perestroika. You're also going to see, kind of like under Khrushchev, artists are going to be able to speak their minds again. You're going to see artists come out and speak out against Stalin and hardline communism. So in a lot of ways, Glasnost kind of turns into a little cultural revolution of the USSR. Again, just a gradual opening up of the Soviet Union to other ways of thinking, to economic structures outside of communism. So again, it's kind of a window to the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. The third element of Gorbachev's plan is democratization. So basically, what Gorbachev is aiming for here is to get rid of all the corruption that existed in the one-party communist rule that had existed for so long. Gorbachev wants to bring a class of more educated experts into the decision-making process in politics. So he wants that to happen democratically. And so what you have in March of 1989 is the first free elections in the Soviet Union since 1917. So that's huge. Gorbachev also is just seeking to reduce tensions between the East and West. And so some of the ways in which he does this. He withdraws troops from Afghanistan, which obviously is really popular, makes the West happy because we know how they reacted to the Soviet invasion in 1979. He also actually encourages reform movements in places where they had previously been squashed, places like Poland and Hungary, right? He actually says, yes, sure, reform, experiment with other, with new economic methods. He also repudiates the Brezhnev Doctrine, which is very significant, very much deviating from his predecessor. He says that he will respect any political choices of peoples in Eastern Europe. So again, kind of the idea that Eastern European countries are no longer directly under the control of the Soviet Union. Then you have Reagan and Gorbachev sign the INF Treaty, which is significant because it's a reduction of nuclear missiles again. So what it does is it bans all intermediate range nuclear missiles from Europe. And so this is just a really big milestone because, again, it shows a reduction of Cold War tensions. It shows the willingness of the leaders from both sides of the from both sides of the Cold War struggle actually agreeing to restrict their nuclear missiles. And think about how this differs from Reagan's earlier initiative, the kind of proclaiming the USSR, the evil empire, the Star Wars initiative, right? This is really significant. It shows us that by the end of Reagan's administration, he's actually willing more to interact positively with the Soviet Union. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that it is Gorbachev in control and not Brezhnev anymore. Then you have the START I Treaty, which was signed by George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev in 1990. And what this does is it cuts back U.S. and Soviet nuclear weapons. So it cuts back 10% of U.S. nuclear weapons and 25% of Soviet nuclear weapons, and it also limits intercontinental ballistic missile warheads. So that's a huge development as well. All these different treaties kind of culminating together. Again, these are really good examples if you were writing an essay to show how when Gorbachev takes power in the Soviet Union, how quickly tensions begin to reduce. And then you start to see different countries in Eastern Europe actually start to abandon communism, which is huge. So there's a series, many countries, one by one, start to end the communist control by the Soviet Union, which had been in place since the 1950s. So this is huge. So why suddenly does the Soviet Union kind of loosen its leash? A lot of this is because it's really expensive to maintain all these satellite countries. The USSR couldn't really handle it politically and economically. It was difficult. Russia itself is gigantic, and there were the other Soviet states, and then there were all the countries under the Eastern Bloc. So it was just too difficult. It's kind of like why the Roman Empire, why the Napoleonic Wars ultimately came to an end, right? Once your empire expands to a certain point, it's tough to maintain. So first you're going to see Poland end its communist control. So there's, again, we discussed solidarity earlier, right? There are going to be some economic problems in the late 1980s, which is going to actually allow the Solidarity Union to be legalized again. So in June of 1989, after Solidarity was legalized, you also have the first free elections in Poland promised in 1989 since prior to World War II. So that's a huge development. And in these free elections, Poland elects the first non-communist leader in Eastern Europe since the Stalin era. So again, that's really, really significant, a non-communist leader. And very quickly, they start to modify their economy. They apply a strategy that's called shock therapy. And basically what this means is that they're going to really quickly start to introduce Western methods to the economy, like reintroducing private property, eliminating state control on industry and prices, because prior to that, under a communist government, the amount of things that you produce, the prices of things that you produce, the wages of people, everything was dictated by the government, which obviously could have an effect on production levels. So this shock therapy, very quickly tried to westernize the Polish economy. And this is going to be sort of an inspiration to other reform movements in other places in Eastern Europe. You're also going to have the leader of Solidarity, Lech Walesa. He's going to become president of Poland in 1990. But later you're going to see the Solidarity movement break up into factions. But still, Poland is the leader of the way in ending communism in Eastern Europe. So definitely important to be familiar with Poland. Then comes Hungary. So Hungary, it's in October 23rd, the Hungarian leaders proclaim Hungary to be an independent republic. And then in between, they establish a coalition government, right? And very quickly, again, sort of like the shock therapy of Poland, they welcome Western investors to contribute to the economy. So again, that shows us how quickly Hungary is willing to abandon communism. And also they open their border to East Germany. So this is really significant because now all these people in East Germany are going to flee into Hungary. They're called vacationers, but that's something we would put in quote because we know that they're really not attempting, they really don't want to return to East Germany. They want to finally live in a place where they're not subject to complete totalitarian communist rule, right? So that's really important that they open their border to East Germany. So Hungary was next. Then very quickly after Hungary opens up its border, then you see the Berlin Wall come down. One of the most monumental events that basically signals the beginning of the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union. So November of 1989, The Berlin Wall is torn down, and very quickly after, the East German government falls, and then you have free elections scheduled in East Germany. So again, this is huge. This is the first free elections we've had since the Stalin era, or since before the Stalin era. And then Germany is reunited reunified in 1990, and then you have I guess, two different predominant there's a predominant government that emerges. It's a conservative liberal alliance for Germany, and that's tied to the West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and his Christian Democrats. They end up defeating the East German Social Democrats. So again, there's much more of a Western influence on the new unified Germany, and not a kind of socialist influence from East Germany. And a lot of this is because when the economies merge and when Germany reunifies, the East Germans see how much more developed West Germany was economically than East Germany. 1990, East and West German economies merge, and we'll talk about the burden that is placed particularly on West Germany in that process. You're also going to see that at first the Soviets are really opposed to having a unified Germany in NATO. We know that West Germany was in NATO, but having East Germany also be involved was something that kind of threatened the Soviets. But eventually the Soviets kind of give in because West Germany promises to give the Soviet Union some really substantial economic aid. So they say, okay, fine, a unified Germany can join NATO. All right, next comes Czechoslovakia. All right, this is December of 1989. It is called the Velvet Revolution. And again, the Czechs are inspired by events that preceded them. So in this case, it was the fall of the Berlin Wall that was very inspirational to the Czechs. They want to break away from Soviet influence. And so the first thing that happens is that there's a general strike in Czechoslovakia. So, ultimately when there's a huge strike and the economy stops producing, basically this causes the government and the economy to fall. Right? When the communist government collapses, you're then going to have a new president. He actually was a playwright, which is interesting. So his name is Václav Havel. So he is the new president of Czechoslovakia. And then in 1993, you're going to have the Czech Republic and Slovakia actually split into two different countries. And a lot of that was because there was an ethnic difference between people within the state, right? There were Czechs and Slovaks that lived within Czechoslovakia. And so, it didn't really allow for a really stable, unified state. So ultimately, they made the decision to split. And then you have Bulgaria, which is not an organized reform movement like you had in Poland and Czechoslovakia, but still, nonetheless, they break away from Soviet control, which is significant. So basically what the Bulgarians do is they have protests, and they demand that the leader of Bulgaria resign, the Stalinist leader, and then they purge Stalinists, and there were some ethnic Turks that actually were sort of estranged from Bulgaria during Soviet control, and actually they encouraged the Turks to come back. So Bulgaria, even though it's not really an organized reform movement, they do get the Stalinist leader to resign, and they get rid of Stalinists in Bulgaria, and then they're free from communist control. Then you have Romania, which is the only really violent instance that we have of an East European country kind of freeing itself from Soviet rule. So there was a dictator ruling Romania. His name was Nicolae Ceausescu, and he's actually, before he's overthrown, he had a bunch of people who were protesting Soviet rule slaughtered. There were like 1,000 people that were killed during the Romanian Revolution in December of 1989. But nonetheless, he ends up getting overthrown and assassinated. But this is important because this is an example of a violent withdrawal from Soviet rule. So this is the major exception. We always know multiple choice. They like to say except. This is the except, right? Romania had a violent revolution. Okay, and then you have Albania also break away from Soviet control. It's important that we know that Albania is Europe's poorest state. It's also important, again, it's kind of a ripple effect, that Albania was inspired by the overthrow of Ceausescu in Romania, and they start to basically stage demonstrations, against the government, and it very much causes the government to fall apart. The communist government falls in June of 1991 in Albania, and then Albania is free from Soviet control. So all of these things ultimately are leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which will be the subject of our next video.